Welcome to our Enzymes Lab. We're going to jump into part A. I've already completed the pre-lab. I have part A, gotten dressed for lab, completed step 1. Step 2, collected all of my materials. I have my 2 test tubes in my test tube rack. I have my 10 milliliter cylinder, my 20 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide, my forceps, and my 2 liver samples. Step 3 is put my test tubes in my rack, so we are set, and we're going to start on step 4. Measure 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide and pour it into 1 test tube. Alright, 2 milliliters, pour it into a test tube. Step 5, using forceps, place a sample, liver sample, into the test tube and push it down with a stirring rod if needed, which apparently I need today. Now we get to watch the bubbles. The reaction rate has already been recorded in the data table for you. On our classroom packets, we recorded this as a rate of 4 for our example. Question 6 asks us what gas is being released and gives us a hint to consider the equation in the pre-lab. So again, this is an enzymes lab using catalase to break down hydrogen peroxide. So our chemical reaction is hydrogen peroxide reacts with catalase to form H2O and O2. You guys get to answer that question on your own. One of those is a liquid, one of those is a gas. Number 7 says a reaction that absorbs heat is endothermic. So if it gets colder, endothermic. And a reaction that gives off heat is exothermic. If it gets warmer, it's exothermic. Feel the temperature of the test tube with your hand. I like to use the back of my hand, and I can tell my test tube is warmer than the glass at the top. So for 7A, I would say my test tube got warmer. And for 7B, if it gets warmer, is that endothermic or exothermic? You guys write the right answer. Then we're going to pour this liquid into our other test tube, being careful not to also pour the liver. Number 9, assuming the reaction is complete, what is this liquid that I just poured in composed of? Again, think about our chemical equation from the pre-lab. Hydrogen peroxide is broken down by catalase enzyme to create H2O and O2. One of those is a liquid, one of those is a gas. Number 10 is a prediction. What do you think would happen if I added more liver to this second test tube? This one that we already used. Do you think there would be a reaction or no reaction? Maybe a small reaction. Put down your prediction. Number 11 says test this by adding another small piece of liver to the used liquid. So I've got my next piece. I'm gonna stick her in there and use my stirring rod to make sure it makes it all the way down to the bottom. And I observe what happens. This time, I've got a couple bubbles, but not really much of anything. So I could consider this a 0 or maybe a 1 to record in my data table under the new liver and used liquid column. Then 12, measure and add another 2 milliliters of 3% hydrogen peroxide and put it into the first test tube with the already used liver. and watch what happens. Again, we got bubbles. We have a reaction happening all over again. I would record my reactions rate. 0 is none, 5 is very, very fast. Remember, our first reaction was 4 in my data table, and then I clean up for part A before we move on to part B. Be right back. All right, jumping into part B now. I have still stayed dressed for lab, and I have grabbed my materials. I have 3 test tubes this time in my test tube rack. I still have my 20 milliliters or abouts of 3% hydrogen peroxide. I have my 10 milliliter cylinder, and this time I have an apple slice, a potato slice, and a yeast sample. So my test tubes are in, and now I'm going to start on number 4 again and measure 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide into each test tube. Then we're going to add each tissue sample into a test tube and record the reaction rate on our data table on the other side. So first, my apple slice. No reaction. Next, my potato slice. A little bit of a reaction. And finally, my yeast sample. And again, a reaction. Better than my potato, but not as good as the liver. Record those 3 and then clean up part B. All right, part C is all about temperature. I'm still dressed for lab. I have collected my new supplies. I have my 2 test tubes in my test tube rack. I have my hydrogen peroxide, my 10 milliliter cylinder. I have my test tube holder. I have my forceps and my 2 liver samples. And I have my hot water bath that I'm going to be very careful not to touch the things on. And my cold water bath and my stopwatch. So let's jump in. My 2 test tubes are upright. In 1 test tube, I'm going to add a liver sample. And make sure it goes in. I'm going to push it all the way to the bottom, and then very carefully cover that with water. Water straight from the sink, just enough to cover it, and then I'm going to place this test tube carefully in the boiling water for 3 minutes. Using my test tube holder. It goes in. And I start my timer. We'll be back at the 3-minute mark. All right, we're at about 2 minutes 50 seconds. So while I was waiting, I poured in my 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide to be able to test this reaction as soon as I'm done. So 3-minute mark, stop my timer using my test tube holder. Carefully taking it out of the water. I'm done, so I'm going to turn that off. Back into my test tube rack, and I immediately add in my 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. And no reaction. Just so you guys can see as well. Carefully hold that up for the camera. No reaction after it's been boiled for 3 minutes. So in my data table under boiled liver, I would record a 0 for my rate of reaction. Then we're going to move on in the second test tube. We are going to add the other liver sample. And going to use my stirring rod or my forceps, whichever I have that works, to push it all the way in. And again, I am going to cover this with just a little bit of water. And this time, it's going to go into a cold water ice bath. And this time, instead of 3 minutes, it's going to be 5 minutes. So, second test tube, in it goes. Reset my timer. 5 minutes this time. While that's going, I'll pour out another 2 milliliters of my hydrogen peroxide to test for enzyme activity at the end of this 5 minutes. So, see you back at the 5 minute mark. All right, welcome back. We're at about 4 minutes, 50 seconds. So, quick recap. We've had our second liver sample with a little bit of water in the test tube, soaking for about 5 minutes now in our cold water bath. I have measured out my 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide and stop the timer. We are going to immediately take it out of the cold water bath. Move things so you guys can see. And add our 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide to our cold sample. And I will let you guys be the judge of if that is the same rate of reaction as our first set, if it is faster or slower. And that is the end of part C. After all that, we just gotta clean up and you're all set to go finish and answer your conclusion questions. See you next time.